Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Z270N Gaming 5 from Gigabyte. So this is Z270 chipset, so it is currently completely irrelevant. But this is a interesting motherboard, so I wanted one. And the reason why it's interesting is it's a mini ITX board that tries to sort of combine extreme overclocking features with, well, mini ITX. And the reasoning behind this is actually rather simple. Mini ITX boards have a great excuse for only having two memory slots, and basically that's the entire reason why Gigabyte actually, like, why I think Gigabyte went ahead and basically made this motherboard an extreme overclocking board at the same time as making it a mini ITX, because, you know, marketing an ATX or an MATX board with only two DIMM slots is kind of hard. Marketing a mini ITX with two memory slots, then it's just normal. That's just how many memory slots you get on mini ITX boards. So that's why they went with the why I think they went with the extreme overclocking features, because of course having two memory slots means they can optimize the trace layout better, and just getting the, you know, the way the actual memory slots work is removing the extra memory slots actually improves signal integrity, because the slots actually share a lot of the traces, and so having just a memory slot, even unoccupied, hanging off of the memory, just hanging off of the trace for no good reason, just isn't, like, it harms your overclocking capabilities. Now, I've not completely, like, you know, not run this board a ton, and I've had it for a while now, but I've really not run it that much. But it does still seem to have the typical Z270 Gigabyte issue of you can't set the command rate to 1 for high frequencies, basically. And I'm not sure where the margin on this board is, but on most of the other Z270 boards from Gigabyte, you set the command, you go above 3600 megahertz, and the command rate has to be 2, because at least as far as I'm aware, there seems to be some kind of layout issue with the command, like with some of the traces for the for the commands. And so if you set your command rate too low, the motherboards refuse to post. And basically this one seems to be exhibiting the same thing, though admittedly I've so far only run it with EDI and only at frequencies in excess of 4000 megahertz, because yeah, I've not really, like, you know, done a focused look at how this thing deals with the command rate, but it does seem to really have issues with 1T, because at 4000 megahertz it just doesn't work. Actually, no, I've also run it in 3733, and there it still needs to be a 2T command rate, so this board doesn't seem to have fixed that. We'll see if it's good for something like 4000 or something like that. I'm hoping it is, because I do want this to basically act as a backup for the Apex 9, for the Maximus 9 Apex I have, because that board's been acting a little flaky. So if that thing stops behaving, I hope to be able to run with this. But right off the bat, it does look like it'll have command rate issues. Anyway, let's start taking a more, you know, physical look at the board instead of just talking about the memory slots for the next hour. Let's not start with taking off the Vrm heatsink. Let's start with taking off the I/O cover. So the I/O cover on this board is not plastic. It seems to be steel. And I'm basing that off the fact that it's rather thin, heavy, and hard. So it's not aluminum as far as I can tell. So, yeah. But the I/O cover, you know, I'm not a fan of it on the basis that basically, because the I/O cover comes down like this here, this Vrm heatsink is really limited in terms of how big it is, right? If this wasn't a thing, this Vrm heatsink could extend, like, all the way over these ports right here. And that would definitely help, because this is a cramped little motherboard. It'll be in cramped little cases, and it'll probably be kind of starved for airflow. But oh, it's not the worst thing ever, because this does actually have a surprisingly solid VRM, and for an ITX board, this is actually seriously impressive. So let's start. Let's get to the VRM part, eh? There's not really much else to this. So let's get that Vrm heatsink off. which is connected by a heat pipe to the chipset, which you could have already seen from the front. And I have made some upgrades to the motherboard because, well, there was a rather nasty surprise related to the Vrm cooling that we'll get to. So if we pull the Vrm heatsink off, as well as the chipset heatsink, you can see that they have some bad, like, I don't know what this is. This isn't thermal paste. This is some kind of thermal pad thing. Like, it doesn't really feel like a normal thermal pad either, so I'm not entirely sure what the hell that's supposed to be. It's not making great contact with the chipset either way, but then again, the chipsets generally run cool, and really, I think, if you have this VRM at heavy load, what'll essentially be happening is heat from the VRM will get dumped into the chipset. It won't work the other way around, so, yeah, I'm not sure about that. The thermal pad is not stock. This is a Thermal Grizzly thermal pad. 1.5 millimeter. It got pretty significantly squished, as you can clearly see the power stages indented into it. But let's pull that off, because here's where the rather nasty surprise starts, and the thermal pad fell apart. That's great. Gonna need to replace that. So yeah, see this VRM heatsink right here has screws going through the bottom plate here, and well, that's not good, is it? Because that basically means you have two separate pieces of metal, and the thing about multiple pieces of metal is that they tend to not have the best thermal conductivity to each other, especially if there's no thermal paste between them. Now, on my board, I know exactly what the thermal compound is between this plate and the actual, like, heatsink part, which is anemic as hell, but it's something. So the thermal paste on my board is Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut. And the reason why there's Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut on it is because originally there was absolutely nothing. Let's get the board out of the way. I don't really want thermal paste dripping all over it. So yeah, I basically just put some Cryonaut down there, because if you get this board stock, there's nothing. Like, literally, the thermal interface material between this little plate and the actual heatsink is air. That, as far as I am concerned, is completely, like, dumb. Okay? Like, I really don't know how that is a thing. Because you'd think that, applying some thermal interface material wouldn't really, like, that would just be a given for this kind of situation, right? But no, it's just air. Like, literally, the board comes stock with nothing between that plate and the actual VRM heatsink. So, well, and the heatsink. So, yeah, I am not a fan of that. And I'm not going to bother doing, like, proper thermal testing against this upgrade that I made, because, again, it's a Z270 board. It's bloody irrelevant. So, maybe if I have a ton of spare, like, if I run out of content to do, I might do some thermal testing on this. But basically, yeah, I was really disappointed when I noticed that, because, I mean, this is a bad heatsink to start with, but when you have, like, miserable thermal conductivity through it as well, that's when you gotta go, like, facepalm really, really hard. And, yeah. Luckily, it's an easy fix, right? Luckily, you just take the heatsink apart, stick whatever thermal paste you have in there, and it should perform a lot better than just having nothing. But still, it's just, like, such a basic, like, oversight. It's like, what the hell? How does this happen? Like, what? Why do you even bother with the heatsink if you're not going to have proper thermal, contact with it? Anyway, let's get to the good parts of the board, because that's pretty much the worst part of it. The VRMs. You have a 6-phase V-core, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 inductors, and a 2-phase iGPU portion. The power stages, you can see that, well, I mean, if you're me, these are obviously international 3553s. If you're not, if you don't follow the channel too much, don't follow the PCB breakdowns, then yeah, these are international rectifier 3553 Power stages, there's 6 of them for vCore, 2 of them for iGPU. It's a true 6+2 phase. The voltage controller is an international rectifier 35201, so that's the standard voltage controller for high-end Z270, Z370, Z170, X370 motherboards, X47 motherboards. Like, this voltage controller is freaking everywhere these days because it's good. And it does any configuration from like 8+0 to 7+1 to 6+2, and then of course you can lower the phase count, so you can technically run like a 4+1 off of it, or a 5+2, or like you can do it like very, very versatile. So here it's running a 6+2 phase. The 3553s are 40 amp power stages, so essentially the maximum VRM power output would be like, well, current output would be something like 240 amps. If you had like way more cooling than this, okay, way more cooling than this, because a single one of these international rectifier 3553s at 40 amps current output is going to kick out about 8 watts of heat. I'm saying that off the top of my head, which might be a bad idea. Let's see if I have the data sheet open. Oh, we're in luck. I do. Okay, I'm off by a watt. They'd kick out 9 instead of 8. Luckily, on Kaby Lake, you're not going to be seeing currents that high. Kaby Lake, even at like 5.1 gigahertz, which I've run on this board. I've run 5.1 gigahertz, 1.42 volts, Prime 95, small FFTs, and basically the VRM output is right around about 100 amps at that kind of those kinds of settings. And you're basically looking at the VRM producing about what was it? Well, about 12 watts of heat. So yeah, I don't really trust this to dissipate 12 watts of heat, but that's actually, like, efficiency-wise, that's really not that bad for a VRM. You know, that's like crammed into this mini ITX motherboard, because a lot of the other mini ITX boards are like 4-phase, and Gigabyte has a board that's 3-phase with discrete power, like discrete MOSFETs, not even proper power stages. So yeah, this is actually a relative, like, I consider this acceptable for like this class of board. I think if you were doing a KB, if this was supposed to run Coffee Lake, I'd like to see 2 more phases on that. So like a doubled up for like a 4-phase with doubling, or 60 amp power stages. If it was still a 6-phase, then 60 amp power stages. Both of those would work. Obviously, both of those would actually take up a lot more space, because a 3553 power stage, which is the straight upgrade from the 3553, is about twice the physical size of a 3553. So the VRM would get actually a lot larger if they used 60 amp power stages instead of 40 amp ones. And obviously that's kind of a problem on a mini ITX board, because you're really cramped for everything. In fact, this board is so cramped that Gigabyte decided that instead of doing 2 dedicated buck converters for the VCCIO and VCCSA rail, they have the VCCIO-SA. No, it's not VCCIO-SA, it's just IOSA rail. And so basically you have this inductor down here, which, if I'm not mistaken, is controlled by that chip there, that's a Richtech RT8120, or that's the RT8120. Like, one of those two is an RT8120. Either way, it's the buck converter, single-phase buck converter of choice for Gigabyte on this board. Like, memory is done by the same thing. But anyway, that thing controls the IOSA rail. And the IOSA rail is generated by this inductor, and these 2 little MOSFETs back here, these are my least favorite MOSFET. Okay, it's actually not that bad. It's an on-semiconductor 4C10N, so the usual one, except this is like the smaller version, the small package 4C10N, and you do get 1 high side and 1 low side. This is actually kind of concerning. Now, the reason why I'm saying it's kind of concerning is because the IOSA rail needs to be able to sustain a combined current of 16 amps, because it feeds the system agent and the I/O of the CPU, and Intel specs the I/O for like 5.5 amps and the system agent for 11. Then again, on this board, well, I guess if you had M.2 plugged in and a high-power GPU and like were really hammering the system, you could actually max out both of those rails at the same time. But still, basically, that needs to be able to push a maximum of 16 amps, and it's on these two little MOSFETs, which, given enough cooling, they'll be fine. The problem is they're on the back of the board, so yeah, that's not great, because this is like the hottest part of the board, because there's no airflow in that area. But that still doesn't solve the issue of, you know, you shouldn't have your system agent and your I/O voltage at the same level. They should be at two different voltage levels. Yeah, so the way Gigabyte deals with that is that the output of that inductor goes into these two MOSFETs right here, which then act as variable resistors, which is just, I mean, it's a unique solution to the problem, but I'm not a fan of the solution, okay? Because essentially, well, basically there's this op amp right here, and IOSA sits at like 1.4 volts output. And then these two MOSFETs are, like, their gate is driven, you know, with more or less voltage, depending on how much voltage drop you'd need. And the problem about intentionally dropping voltage across a MOSFET is that produces a lot more heat than if you just used a, you know, switch, like a buck converter. That's kind of the reason why buck converters exist. They're way more efficient than any kind of linear voltage regulation. Now, luckily, you know, this isn't trying to step down from like 12 volts to IOSA. If they tried to do that, that'd be ridiculous. Instead, they do have the IOSA rail, which sits at 1.4 volts, which then you can drop, you know, 400 millivolts to, you know, you're going to be dropping like 400 millivolts to, if you set both of your SA and IO voltages really, really high, it's going to be dropping nothing, and you'll actually have to boost the IOSA rail because the, like the RDS on of these two MOSFETs causes a voltage drop even if you max out the two rails for it. So that's yeah, this is just it's, I mean, I understand why they did it. It's a cramped board, and this certainly, you know, you basically because what this does is they save on filtering elements, right? They, instead of having two filtering capacitors for system agent and then two more large bulk capacitors for I/O, they have two for both, and then they have a couple ceramics around the output, around the two MOSFETs, and that's all the filtering they need, instead of, you know, basically having twice as many. And similarly, they only need one inductor instead of two, and inductors are bulky, so this does save space, but it's not very efficient because you have about 1 watt of power loss on the, you know, IOSA combined rail, and then you have another 1 to 2 watts on each of the little MOSFETs acting as well. It's actually, it's like point, like, because again, it depends on how much voltage drop you're setting, but if you're drooping, you know, if you're dropping, well, not drooping, dropping 200 millivolts across one of these to get from 1.4 volts to 1.2 volts, if you're pushing 10 amps into the system agent, that's going to be like 10 times 200 millivolts. That's 2 watts. That's a lot of heat. Now, obviously, if you're setting your system agent to 1.3 volts, it actually drops less, so it produces less heat, which is kind of funny. So basically, that voltage regulator gets more efficient the higher the closer your voltage output is to the IOSA rail, and you can change the IOSA rail voltage as well. I think honestly Gigabyte should have given the board the option to set the IOSA rail lower, because for like normal operation you shouldn't be setting your IO or your SA to over 1.3 volts. For overclocking it's fine, but for daily usage you'd be setting like 1.2, 1.25, and these are going to be dropping 200 to 150 millivolts, which is a lot. Like that's going to produce a significant amount of heat. So this is like by far the least efficient way I've seen IO and SA done on a motherboard. But yeah, it does save space, that's for sure. I'm honestly, I'm not sure if like it does mean that like cooling is probably potentially a pretty major concern here, because this is going to run hot. Like, also, those are the smaller versions of the 4C10Ns, and so these MOSFETs are like these MOSFETs intrinsically have a problem cooling themselves. So, yeah, I am I am impressed by the uniqueness of the solution. I am concerned about the effectiveness. Let's put it that way, because that is definitely not the efficient way to do things, even if it is the like, even if it does save space. And those two MOSFETs are actually controlled by this chip right here, the two MOSFETs used to drop down the voltage finally, and that's an op amp over there, 2 channels for your 2 voltages. So, yeah, that's one hell of a solution, Gigabyte. Like seriously, um, like that is really concerning, honestly. Anyway, let's move on. Up along here, you will find a bunch of LDOs, so low dropout regulators. These are rated for a maximum output of 3 amps. And basically, those are used for generating all of the various rails like VCC, PLLOC, DMI. Well, I think it's DMI. DMI is going to be on one of those, I think. PLLOC. There's also the VCC PLL, and just all the different voltages that you need to adjust. Standby voltage and all the different voltages that you need for extreme overclocking are taken care of by those. And I don't know how much current each of those rails specifically needs, but the Intel datasheet sheet indicates most of them around 100 milliamps each. So that is actually that's plenty powerful enough right there. I kind of feel like they should have maybe tried shift the entire vCore VRM up, shift this over, gone for smaller chips to do that, and then given us a proper system agent rail, because this down here like is concerning. The memory power is taken care of by a single phase, another one of those Richtech RT8120s, and that has 3 MOSFETs in it, again 4 C10Ns from On Semiconductor, so and in the reduced size package, so you have 2 low sides, 1 high side. This is fine. DRAM memory really doesn't pull that much power, so that's not a problem. It's actually, in terms of MOSFET selection, not phase count. This is about the same as what you'd get like on a top-end ROG board. Like ROG boards just have 4 MOSFETs in their 4 similar size, similar power capability MOSFETs in their 2-phase design. But this is single phase, so this might be a tad noisier than what you'd get on like an ROG board, but well, I'm not sure if I'll actually try to test that. Either way, that's not concerning as far as the power goes. So, yeah, is there anything I'm missing? Right, VPP is down there. That's proper, that uses a proper buck converter. Fortunately, I can't tell you what MOSFETs it uses because I can't get into that area of the board at all. The capacitors around the board are Nichicon FP series. I don't know how many thousands of hours these are rated for, but I'm going to assume that they're either 5,000 or 10,000 hours rated. Then the actual bulk filtering for the outputs of the VRMs, so like vCore and iGPU and system agent, well, the IOSA combined rail, those capacitors all seem to be, I think they're Panasonic tantalums, but don't quote me on that, because while I have like this packaging, like coloring, the way these look, they look like Panasonic tantalums, but I'm not 100% certain at all. And there's a chance that there's other companies that use the exact same markings, and I've just not seen those before. So, yeah, but those are really nice. Like, if those are Panasonic tantalums, they're really nice high-end capacitors. So, yeah, that's actually that's impressive. Like, there's actually some motherboards out there which are like full ATX, and they'll use these capacitors as like intentionally go for these, because normally these are chosen for their compactness. But sometimes you'll see like top-end boards which, have all the space they need, and they'll still opt for these because these are just better than your typical CAN-type polymer capacitors when it comes to, filtering. So, yeah, those are nice. Then the one thing that is... Oh yeah, and the one thing I've not covered yet is this connector right here. So basically Gigabyte has a little accessory that's a PCB with buttons and like a postcode and voltage read points and all kinds of nice, useful extreme overclocking utilities on it, and they don't sell it. and they don't ship it with the board either. So you get the board and you get this connector for that accessory, and you can't have that accessory unless you like know somebody who works at Gigabyte and send them a strongly worded email about how you really, really want one. And even then, I'm not sure if they'd actually send you one. So this is like, I like the idea of doing this implementation, but if you're not actually going to ship it, just don't put it on the bloody board, because this is just, yeah, that's just annoying, as far as I'm concerned. Because, like, I'd actually really want that accessory, but it just, you can't get it. You can't buy it. It's not sold with the boards, so it's just, yeah, that's a letdown as far as I'm concerned. But, yeah, it's a interesting little motherboard. I really hope, well, I'd really like to see Gigabyte do a motherboard like this for Z370. Well, actually, they do have actually the new Z370N Wi-Fi board looks a little bit less terrible compared to like their previous like it looks like it's halfway between this one and this one's downgrade, like the Z270N Wi-Fi and the Z270, like this is a big step up from the Z270N Wi-Fi in terms of like VRMs and just everything. But the Z370 board actually looks like it's closer to this than it is to the Z270N Wi-Fi, but I've not seen that one in person, so don't quote me on that. Yeah. Anyway, I will be putting this thing on liquid nitrogen, because it does technically have all the voltages necessary to do it. So I'll be interested to see how it actually does under, like, you know, for extreme overclocking, because I've not seen anybody else post LN2 scores with one of these boards, and I'm just interested to see how it does, because, this board does have some of the things necessary, so, well, actually, it has, if we just took it as a checklist, it has everything you need, but how well all of those things are implemented, well, we'll find out, I guess. So, yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment or questions down below if there's a, what do we call it? Right, if you would like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a PayPal, a Patreon, there's also shirts you can buy, and I'm also getting rid of some of my old hardware on the AHOC junkyard. So, yeah, you could check all of those out if you'd like to help the channel out. And yeah, so that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.